implementing science, technology, innovation roadmaps for the 6 transitions. My name is Wei Liu. I'm working with UN DESA. I have quite a few colleagues from DESA join us today in person, and I'm sure there will be more colleagues joining online today. So I'd like to give a little bit of background for today's seminar, and also I will introduce the speakers, presenters today. I mentioned, like in the concept notes, one of the key things we start of bringing the intellectual leadership into this work, into this discussion was the most recent event was in Addis Ababa. Quite a few colleagues actually joined today, also attended the meeting. Jorgen and I went there with colleagues from ECA, host that meeting. So one of the key things from that workshop was trying to help countries to have a clearer ideas on the STI landscapes, and essentially mapping STI capacity or skills. When we talk about the roadmap, the leaders want to know what do they have, and this is super important for preparing a good roadmap and implement it. So this is where we're coming from, and also following that, it was also towards end of the year, December 4, there's a meeting in South Africa, bring also great people, thinkers together in South Africa to continue the discussion on this. And we basically, this webinar is kind of like a continuation of this discussion. I'm so honored to introduce my dear friend, also colleague, Dr. Heidi Hackman. She was a formal, she's a formal CEO of International Science Council and currently director of Future Africa. She will be our main presenter for today's seminar. And we'll have also 2 lead discussants, Dr. Morgan from International Science Council, and also Dr. Anna from UNESCO, joined from Paris. And also colleagues around the table here are all experts. We also friends, as Alex said. So maybe feel free to share your views, because it's really among friends sharing your thinking. And I'd like to pass the floor to Heidi to give a presentation and share some of the examples from her perspective, also the examples from Africa and how African stakeholders promote science, technology, innovation for SDGs.
Thank you so much, Wei. And, I'm glad this is an informal setting with friends. I don't know all of you, but it's good to be back. And so thank you, Wei, for giving us this opportunity. I did send through slides.
Can you open the slide? Abraham, can you share the screen?
Yep, I'll go ahead and share my screen now.
So, Wei, what I thought I would do, I mean, it's focused completely on Africa at this stage. That's, having moved from the International Science Council, one of the big areas of relief for me was that I can focus on one continent rather than the whole world. So I am going to speak, and this is prepared by myself and Farai, about a little bit about what's happening on the continent in terms of science for the SDGs. And I want to be very clear that it's generic, and we are looking here at science, not yet science, technology, and innovation. And that'll become clearer. I think it's one of the challenges we have. So a little overview for you, snapshot really, of what's happening on the continent in generic terms around science for SDGs. And I'm going to look at this across the various sectors of the African science ecosystem. And again, why do it that way will become clearer later, but it is perhaps a basis for future mapping and scoping. Then I think very importantly is to just remind ourselves of the key challenges that African science systems still confront, and look at their consequences of those challenges for the work on science STI for SDGs. And then I want to talk a little bit about a possible way forward that Future Africa is leading on, and that, you know, collaboration with you and the STI coalition would be extremely helpful. So can I go, who's is it Ibrahim?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, thank you. So by way of introduction, I wanted to make a generic comment, and this is just my personal view. I think it was remarkable if we look back at how the SDG framework became rapidly a rallying point for actors across the science ecosystem from national to global levels. Certainly, you know, and I'll mention one or two examples, but it provided a powerful framing narrative for all sorts of institutional policies, new strategies, and initiatives. More importantly, I think because it gave the sense of a global goal-setting exercise, it made collaboration, for example, between funders, what you're going to talk about, the Commission's work, that was enabled by the fact that we were rallying around a common framework. And so I think that's been very powerful. And you certainly will see this in Africa as well. That I think wherever you look, often those strategies and policies were essentially no more than a reframing exercise where people were saying, here's what we're doing for the SDGs, but actually they were just shifting the the chairs on the deck and making it fit, because it is a very inclusive frame. But despite that reframing, and it still happens, you see it all the time, there are good examples of new targeted science for SDG activities. And there are examples of that all over the world, and certainly in Africa as well. And I think it's important to say, not just thematically, but there's a lot of work around the kind of stuff that Morgan will be talking about. What approaches, what kind of science do we now need to really ensure that science has an impact on achieving the SDGs? So, you know, the whole transdisciplinarity movement, if you want to call it that. There's been a lot of that, and it's all shifted around how can we contribute to achieving the SDGs. So that is a sort of generic background, and I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. And Wei, you'll tell me if I'm speaking too much and too long. Next slide, Ibrahim. So let's just run through this very quickly. There's no, you know, you can't go by individual countries, but at a government level, I mean, Agenda 2063 on the Africa we want is very clearly aligned with Agenda 2030, not only in terms of thematic developmental challenges, but in terms of recognizing the role of science, technology, and innovation. Key. And that is repeated. Now, the African Union's Science, Technology, and Innovation Strategy for Africa, STISA 24, is currently under review. And that we'll be contributing to that also on the basis of this collaboration. But it's important to say that that strategy does and has influenced national governmental policies, strategies, and investments in SDG relevant areas. The AU is quite engaged in leveraging funding through development banks, through international partnerships, through donor aid agencies. And a lot of that is about science for SDGs, but there's a strong focus on educational capacity building, producing PhDs, supporting postdocs. There's a lot of capacity building focus in their work. And then, of course, you know, I think we must take stock at a governmental level of the launch of the STI Coalition for Africa's Development in May last year, and that's also a significant, potentially significant development in terms of governmental level action on promoting STI for SDGs. Then if we go to the next slide, we look at what's happening at universities. Universities, I would say, all over the world face the impact imperative. We're all trying to show our relevance, particularly in areas, in a context of resource constraint. And that impact imperative is often framed, I would say, generically along SDG framework. So it's about science for global challenges, local development challenges. The SDGs are increasingly, as we know, used as a reporting framework, and it's made its way into international ranking systems. So universities are reporting on what they're doing, and that's where a lot of the reframing does happen. Please don't quote me on that. But that's where, we take what we are doing and fit it into SDG boxes. But that's happening. And universities are being ranked. It means that the awareness amongst the broader academic community of the Sustainable Development Goals is constantly increasing. A lot of the early career capacity development initiatives, the ones that we see coming our way at Future Africa, which is a Pan-African platform, and particularly those that are internationally funded, it is surprising to find something that you can't fit into the SDG, where we're building capacity for meeting the SDGs. And then I think importantly also to say that when you look at universities on the continent in terms of their own networks and collaborative initiatives, Pan-African initiatives, you will see initiatives like the African Research Universities Alliance, ARUA's centers, continental centers of excellence, and now clusters of research excellence. These are large initiatives. The clusters of excellence are awarded for 10 years, and they are co-supported by the EU Guild of Universities. Those, if you look at the thematic landscape there, they're all about SDGs. They fit beautifully into the framework. And if we look at our discussions with around higher education policy, dialogues with bodies like the Worldwide Universities Networks and many other international networks, the SDG always provides a nice framing for those discussions. So what is the role of universities in? And it's always related to the SDG. So lots happening at the university level. Then we look at academies. Some of you will remember that between 2016 and 2019, the whole SDG framework became a central focus of the work of the Inter-Academy Partnership, the IAP. They've produced numerous reports about how do you build the academy's capacity to respond effectively to the SDGs. And if you now look at the advisory work of those academies, if you look at their consensus reports, I would say 80% of them are on SDG related topics. So the academies are there playing that science advisory role at national level. And of course you have bodies that, again, networks of academies like the African, well, not the African Academy is not a network, but it's a continental academy, individually based, individual members, and the network of African science academies. Those two bodies also have quite a prominent role, increasingly prominent in funding programs. So the African Academy with the African Union, with Gates, with the World Bank, they are funding science across the continent. The network of African science academies less so, but they've also got funding programs. And again, the SDG is a great framing tool for them and they use it. Then let's look at funders. I think this is the critical one. So at a national level, it's hard to say, but you will find in most of the 17 science granting councils that collaborate in that African Science Granting Council initiative. I was at a meeting recently and they were all handing out brochures about how they support the SDGs, right? So that awareness is there amongst the national funders. Some national funders, like the South African National Research Foundation, has had a long-standing separate department looking at funding research on global challenges, which now you can just, impose nicely on the whole Agenda 2030, and funding initiatives that go with it. But I think what is, for me, is more interesting is that although the African Science Granting Council's initiative itself is not a funding mechanism, but it's about building the institutional capacity of funders on the continent, what is interesting is that through the support of bodies like IDRC, CEDA in Sweden, and others, the UKRI, the Science Granting Council members, so individual funders in Africa, are becoming increasingly involved in multilateral funding platforms that are very much focused on funding global science for the SDGs. The Bellman Forum is an obvious one. It's a global forum of national funding agencies to fund global change research, global challenge research. Most recently, the Global Research Council, which has been a forum for policy exchange and dialogue and statements on science policy issues, are now undertaking collaborative funding initiatives. And their very first initiative, which involved African granting councils, was focused on SDGs. And the Global Forum of Funders, the ISC Sustainability Commission, is going to rely on that community to take forward its work, bringing together national funders, donor aid agencies, foundations, and others. And Africa is waiting for that, right? So that's all very positive. And then, of course, there are other sources of funding whereby the National Research Foundation of South Africa has, I don't know how many hundreds of bilateral agreements. And I think those funding arrangements also, you would find, if you dug into that, are nicely shaped and fit onto the SDG framework. And then international and regional foundations, and we'll say more about our reliance on those. But regional foundations like the Science Foundation for Africa, is that the right name?
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, very strong focus on global challenge with an African perspective, science in and for sustainable development in Africa. So then there are, finally, just to finish the ecosystem, quick and dirty overview, there are other things happening which I think are also all positive signs. So you have Future Earth, the big international sustainability science program, which was set up in 2012 and has hubs all over the world, didn't have one in Africa, now has a hub in Africa. It's being led by Future Africa at the University of Pretoria and Rhodes University, but we are setting up a continental structure. And the ambition there is to build an African Sustainability Science Association. So really to convene and coordinate across the continent what we're doing in this space. There are many other initiatives, lots of them we host, like the Africa Hub of the International Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium. That is all about how can we be more innovative in linking science, technology, and innovation to transformation, innovation policy. There are many regional centers across the continent of the SDSN. The Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa, which is a new initiative launched about a year or 18 months ago, strong focus on promoting SDGs on the continent. And, right, ... There are lots of initiatives. So conclusion from all of this is that there's a lot happening, and there is, the capacities are being built. But of course, it depends on how we define what we mean by STI capacities. But the capacities are being built, early career initiatives, the scientists are, and we haven't done work on the impact of science in Africa on on achieving SDGs, but that could be done. There are outstanding scientists on the continent, but there are critical challenges that kind of put all this movement in these various sectors into I think, the context that we have to think about when we take forward the roadmap work way. So the first one, we don't have to go into detail, but is the funding flows in Africa.
Mm.
So low levels of public investment has remained unchanged at around 0.3% of government expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP, 0.3% for the past 3 decades, which is 9 times lower than the average for high-income countries and just falls short of the AU ambition of 1% of GDP. In some cases, that percentage has actually gone down in recent years. At the same time, in most African countries, the business sector's contribution to R&D is absolutely negligible. We've got the facts and figures for that, but those are 2 critical elements. Government expenditure, and they're under huge pressure because the private sector is not investing in public R&D. So the consequence of that is that we have a continued reliance on foreign sources of funding across the continent. And that leads to it underlines and reinforces a culture of scientific competition at a time when we know and when we talk about the need for collaborative action to meet these challenges. So there's a strong culture of competition. Scientists are competing for scarce resources, and that leads also inevitably to a duplication of efforts. Another big concern is that with the over-reliance on foreign sources is that the agendas are still predominantly set by donors in the north, funders in the north. And there's increasing concern amongst African scientific communities about not only the competition it generates, but the fact that we are not setting our own agendas that are necessarily addressing the sustainable development challenges, needs and interests in Africa. So sorry. And with that comes still concern, now very prominent actually, around inequitable modes of international collaboration. We can say a lot about that. We're part of an initiative around a new global charter for what we call transformative collaboration between Africa and the global north. But those are the concerns that this funding situation, and as I say, why is this relevant to the SDG discussion, is because we talk about the need for collaboration. And this undermines that. The funding situation in Africa undermines that collaborative imperative. And of course, the investments from the private sector mean that in reality, although you will find good examples of science industry linkages in many universities, for example, but overall, a weak engagement between science and industry. And that undermines our potential of our science system to be transformative, to lead to not only achieving SDGs, but in ways that are potentially inform and support fundamental systems change, the transformation that we always talk about. So this undermines our efforts. The next challenge is around, well, if you look at Africa as a continent, there's just such enormous variance across Africa in the resource base, both financial and human, and hence the robustness of national science systems. So we've had lots of discussions during recent meetings, including Africa Week, about can we even talk about African science? And I think we need to take that seriously, because if you talk about African science, it's also easy for funders or anybody to talk about an Africa strategy, but we might need multiple strategies because there's such diversity. The other problem is that with that diversity, Pan-Africanism, our efforts, and we see this at Future Africa, often has a very limited reach, because if you think about bodies like the Research Universities Alliance, they bring together the research-intensive universities. So it's always a certain number of countries. The countries that participate, their national funding agencies that participate in the Belmont Forum, for example, are those that have a little bit more money, but it's 3 or 4 out of a continent of 54. So we have to be careful when we talk about African STI for the SDGs and about an Africa strategy or an Africa mapping. It's actually a complex, and we need to make sure that in this we don't leave countries behind. They tend to become invisible. People say we've worked on Africa, but actually it might be a limited set of countries. That's another big challenge for us. And then the next slide is about the siloed action. So silos, I think for me, critical silos are transdisciplinarity and engaged science has become such a fashionable thing. Everybody's got a strategy. I mean, ours is a transdisciplinary platform. The university invested millions to build this platform. But we're forgetting about the importance of interdisciplinarity, which was at the heart of the creation of the IOC. And that the social and human sciences, and you see this a lot in Africa, are not fully integrated into our sustainability science field capacities, whatever. So we can't forget about that. The other silos are, and this is why, I can only talk really sensibly about science for SDGs. Science, technology, and innovation requires a different set of actors, different set, those are siloed domains still in many, many ways. A lot of people would disagree, and if you look at DSI, the Department of Science and Innovation Policy in South Africa, you'll see them integrated. But in practice, we are working on science for SDGs. Others at the university are working on technology for SDGs. Still remain quite separate. And then collaborative action in Africa occurs, and I'm sure this might be happening elsewhere in the world, but occurs within those sectors, and that's why we chose to present them like that. There isn't coordination and integration and critical strategic dialogue, not much of it, across universities, academies, funders, government policymakers, and other initiatives. And that means that the kind of knowledge we need for transitions, which is about transformative action, that knowledge is not a reality. We can't take it for granted. That's a capacity and an institutional strategy that we still have to build. But it also means that we're undermining the collective potential of science in Africa. Right? So I think these are issues, apart from undermining the visibility and voice of science in Africa on a global stage, this siloed action is quite a setback for us. So let's look at what might be the way forward. And I don't want to say much about this, except to say that one of the initiatives we've undertaken, and this is the meeting that you mentioned, Wei, in your introduction. On the 4th of December last year, we convened at Future Africa in collaboration with colleagues from the International Science Council, what is really a first meeting of bringing together leadership from across that ecosystem. And we had really good representation from each of those sectors, government to funders, to universities, academies, and across the continent. And the idea being that, could that such a forum, which could meet on a regular basis of committed and influential partners, could we work together on the basis of common purpose and shared value and tackle issues, become a resource base for all sorts of initiatives, be it promoting open science in Africa, be it promoting STI for SDG roadmaps. And of course, the STI coalition would be a very powerful initiative for this forum to support and work with. So let's skip the next two slides, which is really just about who and what of the forum, but we can come back to that. I want to go to my last two slides, which is an afterthought. You remember I started this discussion by saying it's amazing how the SDG framework has been adopted and rapidly became a rallying point. But I think what I'm seeing now, today, we are talking about urgent course corrections, tactics, mechanisms, initiatives. We are all concerned about the lack of progress and in many cases, real setbacks in achieving SDGs and the climate agreement, for example. And we're dealing with this in a new global reality of polycrises, right? So what I'm hearing from colleagues in Africa, globally, is more and more questioning the future value of global goal setting. All this rallying we did around the SDGs in various sectors of science, what has it led to? People are searching for new strategies to address failures at the science policy practice interface. Despite all the moves towards transdisciplinarity and engagement and multi-stakeholder 10-member groups, right? What has it all meant? What has it all added up to? And I think people are saying, you know, transformations is just talk. It's easy talk. It features in every speech, but we don't really know what transformations entail. We don't know how to recognize them. And we certainly don't know what is the role of science, technology, and innovation in informing and supporting profound, urgent systems change. So that's a different mood from 2015 to 2016. So the last slide is just to say that I think we are at a very critical moment where we have to take stock of challenges and opportunities and look for the leveraging points. Where have things worked? Where can we scale up? We have to confront elephant in the room issues, and I think there are many. And obviously that goes with thinking out of the box. We have to try new things. We can't go back to old criticisms of why science policy engagements don't work. We've been there, we've done that, right? I think we have to shift our focus from focus for action more to the local level, less at the global, and we really need to look at what is happening and what's working at local levels. And I think we have to, in line with that, listen to and learn from global South experiences and perspectives more. And those have often been lost in the global goal setting exercises. And that isn't going to be important for us at that regional level, global South level, to convene and mobilize collective capacity, skills, intelligence, wisdom, and resources. And so we're very grateful that our focus on Africa and our experiences at Future Africa can possibly find a way of being useful also in the work that you're doing at DESA. Leave it at that.
Wow. Thank you so much, Heidi, for that. For me, it's really like a mind-blowing. I learned quite a lot. It's much beyond what we actually want to achieve in that particular part of the work on the guidebook, but you really offer quite a number of important questions, and also, of course, give us a lot of thoughtful suggestions on the way forward for the chapter. Maybe if colleagues have one or two burning questions want to raise before we go to the next. For me, I like to ask, I think you also ask when you present at the beginning, when we talk about mapping of STI capacities. So first thing we want to know is how do we define about STI capacity?
Yeah.
You categorize the way like universities, academy, also founders. Those are somehow like also institutional capacity.
Yes.
This is actually a very unique perspective. I never think about that. I think it's quite important elements for policy people to when they try to understand a landscape, to navigate their pathways, to understand better what are the institutional capacities on STI. I think that's quite important. So it's for me, we need to really define around the table and after the meeting, we need to define how do we measure, how do we define the framework and the principle and guidelines so that we have a common understanding, a clear understanding among UN colleagues, among us, and we can inform policy makers in an effective way, a concrete and effective way. And I see my colleague and friend, George Asambi, Dr. Asambi from Ghana, raise his hand. George, please. And if you have anything, please raise your hand.
Hello, George.
Hello. Adam. Thanks very much for that very lightning presentation. And I just want to zero into this question of how we can get African governments to do a lot more for STI. Anytime I hear or read about our failure to achieve the 1% GDP investment in STI, then my mind goes to the question of what more we can do to get our governments more committed in investing in STI. And of course, we know that the investment can also come from the private sector, but fundamentally, the government has to be more committed so it can even create the enabling framework for private sector investments. And so I thought that maybe if you have some more specific thoughts to share with us in that direction, you may bring up Heide. Thank you.
I wish I had, George, but I do think that if there is, you know, the beauty of an African Science Leaders Forum, which brings together your leadership from across the ecosystem, then I think you have a stronger collective voice advocating for the need for investment. Because, George, do you remember recently when we were at the Science Granting Council's initiative meeting in Mombasa? What struck me and horrified me was that there were heads of granting councils talking about how what they needed from us was a directory of international funding sources. So the whole, you know, the mindset is about if we need money, we go and look overseas. Instead of thinking about, as a collective of granting councils, what can we do to put collective pressure on governments around the funding situation? So I think a forum that can convene and tackle these, that's an elephant in the room question. And of course, at the same time, it's about making the case for why that investment is required. But I think that's been done globally for let me not say more. Sorry, I could get passionate about this.
But thank you so much, George.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we can continue.
Anna has her hand.
Anna, and yes, please, Anna.
Sorry, just one question. It actually follows from George's question and Heide's answer. Is there any scope in thinking about some kind of fund for science in Africa, a joint fund? So, of course, Leaders Forum, there can be synergies and people kind of commit to doing certain things. But we are thinking also whether there is scope for a funding, a proper continental funding mechanisms. Like we are looking into now the revision of STISA 2024, what comes next. Is this something that would make sense from your point of view, or is it something that actually wouldn't make sense? Because there might be some appetite in the context of the African Union to set up some kind of a fund for science, but does that sound like a good idea, and can that be some kind of a solution to some of these issues?
Right, I see you want to respond to that.
Yeah,
and I'm happy for you to do that. From my side, I would just say that this is, the idea of an African Research Council has been in discussion for at least 3 or 4 decades.
And it's not working.
Farah?
Yeah, so I think, Anna, you referred to the STI and the STISA review, and one of the recommendations which came from the STISA 2024 review was setting up an Africa STI fund. And my understanding is that the African Development Bank has made some commitments setting up that fund, whether it happens or not, because I remember there was an agreement also, I think, about 10 years ago to set up an education fund, and it never happened. So, yeah.
It's never happened, not because they don't want, right? So the question is whether you think it's a valuable thing.
So yeah, I think there's a need for something like that, at a continental level. It's just that I don't know the mechanisms, at the continental level, how they work. Everyone is facing all these financial challenges, so that's where the shortcomings always are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would say valuable, but it would have to be very clearly this issue of, the diversity of African science. You'd really need to think about that, because who would, if they follow the kind of European Research Council model of funding, you would not be building or spreading the benefit of such a fund across the continent. George probably also has very strong views on this, I imagine.
Maybe you can get back to you, George. I saw Alex really have some points to contribute here. Alex, please.
No, first of all, thank you, Heidi. It's so great to have you here and to hear your thoughts after all those years of discussions that we've had in the past. And I see George and the 10-member group alums, so to speak. Most of them are still active in their own pockets and areas where they think. So that gives me some kind of hope that whatever we do at a global level does have some impact, even though it's very hard to, as you say, to actually measure that, right? But I think there's an underlying, beyond these actions that everyone does, there's an underlying principle one could use to answer this kind of questions. Do we need an African fund to support research, right? So it's not just something that must happen at the global level. In Europe, we've had decades of discussions on the subsidiarity principle. To use it to see at which level of governance should we discuss and fix and implement what. And there's lots of controversies about this, of course, and historically it's evolved in certain ways, that you environment and trade, for example, at the EU level, but other things not. And there's lots of inconsistencies, but it has evolved historically. So when you can do the same thing, it's obvious that most impact will be at the local and national level. And that's where everything has to happen. But what are the structures? And if you use that subsidiarity principle, what can be done, say, at a sub-regional level, at a bilateral level, at a regional level for Africa, or at a global level? So what is the value added of that? And only if a good case can be made for that. So if, as you say, the African STI community is sufficiently coherent, so that this makes sense, that everyone can be able to, or we have that belief that those weaker parts of the system benefit from the cooperation, as you know, with the EU approach essentially on that. There are some stronger ones and some weaker ones, and they get pulled up over time, but it's costly, right? So is the political level there to support that or not? So I think this should be used, the subsidiarity principle should be used. So for any of these questions that we're discussing here, we have a good case that is based on absolute value added. And the other aspect of subsidiarity level is this worked in the EU case very well because the institutional links, all of this is institutionalized. Whereas all the initiatives that come out from our global level, since it's being reestablished as a discussion at the UN. I mean, let's face it, it's not that long ago. 2012, we started the discussions. So it's barely 12 years that we do have these discussions, even at the global level. Before we didn't. I mean, not at that level at least. So these links have to be there. And if they're not there, even if you have a value-added case, these institutional setups, like a fund, they will rise and fall with the political wind. And only if the political support is there, it will work, and maybe, it fails with the individuals leaving and so on. And we have the same problem here at the global level. I mean, frankly, you yourself gone through several rises and falls of science policy at the UN. I mean, if they want to be that direct. So, if it's not institutionalized, it cannot survive, and the subsidiarity principle cannot tell you the actual answer in the end. So, and then that brings me to the last point on, you suggest the STI Leaders Forum for Africa, which obviously can bring this kind of impetus, similar to other things, and maybe one can make a value. But my question would be, what are the institutional links there? You have a big set of partners, right? But for example, from a UN point of view, we know there is an Africa STI Forum every year. I think the 6th one is this year in April. So how is it institutionally aligned? I mean, for that matter, the African Forum is not institutionally aligned with our global one, which is a big issue. Even though you're part of the same organization, there are no institutional links for political reasons. So when you think about your idea, if you build these institutional links, it will be much bigger and it will survive beyond individuals. Some driven individuals who can make this. If it's not institutionalized, it will be much weaker. So be my main reflection on this.
Very, very important point. I agree.
Thank you. I think if you have any other questions, we can keep it. We do have a Q&A session. We still have 2 more speakers. Supposed to be the discussion, the commentators following Heidi's brilliant presentation. So the next one will be from International Science Council, Dr. Morgan. Maybe floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Dr. Morgan Sieg, representing the International Science Council. I'm the ISC liaison to the UN system. Of course, Heidi also has a long history with the ISC. Really happy to be here, and thank you. That's a brilliant presentation. I'll pick up on a number of the points that you raised, but I think that the ISC's main point in relation to what you've said is we were so honored to be able to participate in the Science Summit South Africa. Really, that the way that we see ourselves in relation here is to listen and learn. And how can a global organization like the ISC best support the scientific community in Africa? Where's the balance of amplifying voices versus using our resources, leveraging them so that we can help the world to listen better to those voices? So we're here to learn, and you've given us lots to take forward. Would you mind putting up my slides as well? And while that happens, I think that everybody here is familiar with the ISC, but in case not, really briefly, we bring together more than 250 organizations worldwide, national, regional, and global, including national academies, research councils, international disciplinary unions, and others to convene science advice and brokerage across the multilateral system. So that's my elevator pitch. And we can move on to actually the next slide. We've skipped right through that. Thank you. I'm going to begin by the previous one. Yes, thank you. I'll begin by reiterating what I think is the central message of what we're discussing here today and what the guidebooks are in the sort of at the highest level in the big picture trying to convey, which is that although we among friends here are all very well aware of how critical science is to achieving the SDGs, to enabling the 6 transitions, that's not something that's widely enough understood, especially by decision makers. And so the ISC repeatedly stresses, as does Future Africa, as does DESA, just how vital science is, broadly understood, including the social sciences, to breaking down those silos in understanding and action, to understanding the root causes of challenges we face, and to addressing synergies and trade-offs among solutions. So science, not just an issue, not just a stakeholder group, but a critical knowledge tool to achieve the SDGs. And so, however, an important caveat is that there are some really significant transitions that need to happen in order for us to really be able to leverage STI systems, especially science systems, including through new approaches to harnessing, to assessing, to conducting, and especially to funding science. And that's the second main point that I'm going to make today. And we can move on to the next slide, please. Which is that although there are no panaceas to addressing these problems, we do need to see a shift in the landscape of science systems worldwide so that we can align STI skills, capacities, activities with the SDGs, really leverage that multiplying effect of the 6 transitions. And here again, Heidi's key messages about the need to move away from fragmentation, away from siloing, away from competition, and towards integrated approaches that are collaborative. So the first STI guidebook pointed out just how important mission-oriented science is for achieving the SDGs and for incorporation into STI guidebooks. However, it also issued the important caveat that the impact of mission-oriented science is seriously limited by its persistent bias toward the global north. That is a problem. We don't yet have the enabling conditions to deploy mission-oriented science at the needed scale or in the most important areas. And so what the ISC is arguing is that we need a major shift in vision, in commitment, especially from science funders, and here, especially from member states. That's a key message as well, to leveraging the resources that we have toward actionable, collaborative, scientific research in sustainability studies that responds to societal needs. And the ISC refers to this as flipping the science model. So to address this, the ISC established a global commission on science missions for sustainability. And here, Dr. Heckman was among its distinguished members, so you may also have insights to share on this. But one of the outcomes of this commission was to point out that a key tool to advance mission-oriented science where and how it's most needed is to take essentially a big science approach, like what was done to establish CERN, to mobilize international resources so that they can invest at scale in human infrastructure for locally led collaborations towards specific development problems. We call this, the model that's been proposed are science missions for sustainability. What science missions for sustainability do, most importantly, is walk the walk on transdisciplinarity, as Haida mentioned earlier. So these are collaborative consortia of not just scientific experts, but also policymakers, NGOs, local and indigenous communities, businesses who are working together to design and implement ambitious projects that are time-bound, they're specific, but they're targeting development-related goals. That transdisciplinary nature, I know that Heida's mentioned it, but I'm just going to hone in on this again, because the way that we see this is that to achieve transdisciplinarity, the research has to be multi-stakeholder collaborations that co-design research and co-produce knowledge, which is what enables research projects to address the most urgent and, here's the key, contextually appropriate research questions from the beginning. We're trying to move away from that bias that Haida mentioned of having foreign investment really drive the agenda. This is responding to questions identified collaboratively from the start, locally led research. Speaking of locally led, the projects also are all rooted in specific local, sub-regional, and regional contexts, which enables, on the one hand, the projects to ensure that they're addressing the areas where the SDG is most lagging, but then similarly, that there's local leadership from within the affected regions. let's see. Yes, and the big exciting update here is that actually within the next few weeks is when the ISC is going to be issuing its first call for proposals for science missions for sustainability. So that's a big piece of news from the ISC. We will let everybody in this room know when it's been launched. We're expecting within the next few weeks. And the plan from here is that by early 2025, we expect to have up to 5 pilot programs announced, which will begin an 18-month co-design phase with up to $250,000 available to support each of those pilot programs in that co-design phase, then leading to a co-implementation phase, and ultimately hoping to scale up this model with regional hubs that are in collaboration and conversation with one another, again, making sure that these principles are at the forefront. And the real takeaway from this model that I'd like to convey here, because I know we're speaking about this in the context of the guidebook and aligning STI skills capacities with the 6 transitions, is that we would really recommend that the guidebook reflect and that member states also pick up on the idea that as we create roadmaps, and especially thinking about funding plans, about plans for building skills and capacities, to keep these key principles in mind, because this is the direction that science needs to go, in addition to supporting disciplinary research, which has made such critical contributions until now, but that transdisciplinarity, co-production, systems thinking, local leadership, mission-oriented science needs to be more at the forefront, at scale, and in the areas where it's really needed. Now I'll move on to the last slide, where I just have one additional point to make. Ibrahim, thank you very much. Which is that another major area of activity and concern for the ISC is around science advisory systems. And I highlight this also in terms of thinking about the needed skills and capacities to ensure that our STI for SDGs roadmaps can actually help enable those 6 transitions and achieve the SDGs. From the ISC's perspective, these are a vital link to make sure that actionable knowledge can actually be leveraged through roadmaps to achieve the SDGs. And yet, they're really underutilized science advisory systems, especially at the national level. And so we would like to encourage the guidebooks to reflect this, and also member states to take up the idea that capacitated science advisory systems, especially at the national level, that equip science brokers with the skills that they need and with the independence that they need to ensure that the scientific inputs they provide are, that the inputs are robust, that there's integrity to the inputs, that they're actionable inputs, that this is how we ensure that the right questions are transmitted from the policymakers to the scientific community, and then in turn that the scientific community can convene the right synthesis of information from the right fields. It's not something that happens on its own with a magic wand. It really takes a collaborative effort. There need to be capacities and skills to make sure that that's done in a way that responds to the needs in the policy and societal realms. And then that information is translated for non-specialist audiences and transmitted back in a way that's practical and implementable and timely. So this is another process that we would really strongly encourage to be reflected so that we can leverage STI systems worldwide toward the 6 transitions, toward the SDGs. And I'll just mention, I don't have it on the slide, but the International Network for Government Science Advice is an affiliated body of the ISC that's doing really fantastic work here. They'll be holding a meeting in Kigali later this year. Happy to provide more information there. They're an affiliated body of the ISC. Now, I'll leave it there for now, but looking forward to more conversation and happy to provide more information about any of this as useful and to continue supporting what's happening on the African continent and through the guidebooks. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ibrahim, can you move the last slides? The one before, thank you. Yeah, really appreciate you actually give us quite a concrete suggestions on some of the key elements in here, the 6, what should we call it, 6 key building blocks moving forward to help us to organize our thinking on when we do categorization of the STI capacity mapping or mapping of the skills. So those are the things should be kept in mind, especially I like the last point, actionable. It's and that's linked to the Patty's point, make it more maybe local level or national level, so it's it's quite important principle. I'd like to work with you and also other colleagues, particularly on expand the key building blocks or principles on moving these things forward. So, and I also understand from last conversation, we talked quite a lot on the funding issues. We actually have a dedicated chapter, and I saw this Declan, I saw you join this meeting too. So we do have a dedicated a chapter on the guidebook regarding to the financing for STI. So a lot of discussion here will help quite a lot to advance our work on the financing part. I don't know if colleagues want to reserve those questions and comments later for that part, but I don't know if maybe if you have any question, you can post on the chat room. Also in the room, you can just tell us you want to come into make comments. Maybe we can move on to the next speaker, which is my dear colleague from UNESCO, Anna.
Yes, thank you.
Joining from Paris. Anna, floor is yours.
Thank you, Wei, and thank you for having UNESCO also. I won't be talking too much. I'd rather have us have a conversation also. But maybe just to mention a few of the maybe tools that UNESCO has in helping with these types of mapping of STI systems more broadly, which is probably what is also needed in order to be able to map the capacities and skills for roadmap exercises on transitions as well. So, you know, within UNESCO, we have this GoSpin methodology and the platform, which is the Global Observatory for Science, Technology, Innovation Policies and Policy Instruments. And in that context, we worked with member states to provide assistance with kind of mapping their STI landscape. And we produce country profiles that are based on these specific assessments. So when you're asking about what methodologies you can use to map capacities, you can have a look at the methodology that is being used in these country profiles, and you can adapt it to whatever purposes you need. The country profiles are also very interesting in the sense that they kind of bring together the traditional way of assessing STI systems, the R&D investments, the human resources, institutional resources, etc., as well as the different science-oriented policies, science-relevant policy instruments that exist to promote science in a specific country. So I think these country profiles can really be a good source of information and also inspiration for further types of mapping in the area of STI. I think what we see as critical in general, and we actually have less and less information that is comparable, is the data on STI. So Heide was talking about investments in research and development, but in general, collection of data on science, technology, innovation based on the Frascati manual or other is lagging behind. And even our UNESCO Institute on Statistics has been struggling with data collection, and that is critical. And I think it has to be made very clear in the roadmap that collection of data really is key, because if you want to use that as evidence for decision making, you will need to have robust data, and you will need to have the capacity of the statistical institutions to also collect data on STI, that you can have a look at the trends, that you can compare different countries, not in terms of ranking them, but really in terms of trying to understand where they stand in their science systems. Another way that we have, and another kind of set of resources that we have, are these outlooks that we produce regularly, where we kind of zoom into a specific issue. We have just published the Open Science Outlook with kind of status and trends in terms of open science. It has been published now in December, and it again gives you a way of mapping the landscape of open science practices across the globe, and then with focus on different regions. Another outlook which will be coming up soon, and I see that my colleague Cornelia has also joined, and she can give you more information, is this outlook that is going to have a look at what STI policies and instruments, STI instruments exist to look into the SDGs, to promote the SDGs. So really what type of policy instruments are there? We collect that information from the platform that we have, the GoSpin platform, where there's a lot of different instruments already there from more than 90 countries, but we never kind of take the time to analyze the information that is already there. And I think that's another point, that there are already sources of information that need to be used when one is doing mappings, rather than recreating new platforms and new observatories and new spaces to collect information. We have the UNESCO Science Report also that can be very, very useful for these kind of exercises. We were just discussing the other day, once we have the results from Heide's team, it would be very, very interesting to see how we can also integrate that into the next edition of the UNESCO Science Report, because these are kind of parallel and exercises that are, it wouldn't make sense for us to do again some kind of mapping for Africa, for example, if that is already done by this team. Another point that I would like to just mention, because it was mentioned by Heide in her presentation, is the fact of working sub-regionally. Of course, there is scope in working at the regional level, but we have been working more and more also with the sub-regional bodies, like SADC for the South African region, or ECOWAS for Western Africa, Eastern African Community, and they have their own strategies, sub-regional strategies for science, technology, innovation. They are looking, for example, now into developing their own strategies for open science, because indeed there is diversity in the different regions, and that diversity has to be captured in some way so that it can be meaningful, whatever roadmap or whatever kind of strategy you put forward. We mentioned already the STISA 2024 revision, and I think that's an important moment to introduce innovations maybe in the strategy for STI in Africa, including through science elements or roadmap elements or other ways of innovating in the way the strategy for STI for Africa can be created. And then the last point before we go into questions and discussion is that UNESCO, we also kind of gather all of these experiences and with countries and from the different science actors into the development of these normative international instruments on science. The examples are the Open Science Recommendation that was developed in 2021, the Recommendation on Science and Scientific Researchers from 2027, the recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence. I mean, these are all also global frameworks, and the countries that adopted them, and in our case, it's all of our 194 countries, they have to implement them, and they have to kind of report back to UNESCO on the implementation of these instruments. So if we can somehow align what is in these recommendations with what might be in the guide or in the next thinking on the next steps for STI development in Africa or elsewhere, that might also be very useful, because that also reduces the number of initiative and strategies and other things that the countries receive from the international level as a way of recommendation for the way forward. And I think if we can somehow make the connections between these different international frameworks, that can also be much easier for the countries, because maybe they're already doing something while implementing the Open Science Recommendation that then can be used for some other activities and initiatives as well. maybe just in terms of the leaders forum to respond to the Heide's suggestion, as I said also, and I think Alex said it also, we do have the STI forum for Africa that definitely needs a little bit maybe of revamping. There is need for a higher visibility, and maybe the combination of some kind of leaders forum and the existing forum might be a way forward. And then indeed, I agree with Alex, there needs to be some kind of institutional link into other initiatives. Otherwise, I don't see how the commitments can be strong enough to actually, be implemented in different countries. But if there is a way of thinking about that, and again, an innovation in the way that can be done, happy to hear about that as well. Another thing I think that was interesting in Heide, your talk, is this idea that we have to do action on local level. We have the strategies at the international level, we have some of this framework, but the action needs to take place on the local level. And I really agree with that, but I think it's very important not to silo that action again. It has to happen in connection with other countries, with the neighboring and other countries. Particularly, again, I'm thinking in the terms of open science, where the idea is that you also share resources and infrastructures and other things. So yes, working locally, but really thinking about what the connections are with other places. And then one last thing, also looking into the way you have structured the presentation, governments, universities, academies, funders. We have seen, particularly with open science, that science is actually also happening elsewhere. These are the traditional academic kind of places for science production. But between the citizen science, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, how do we bring all of that in, particularly if you're thinking about solutions, right? So how do we also open up in that sense, and how do we bring that in the context of roadmaps, in the context of just thinking about science as an enabler for solutions? So that's maybe also something to think about more, and particularly in the context of Africa, because there is a lot of knowledge outside of the traditional scientific, let's say, institutions. So bringing that in is going to be very, very important, I think, also going forward. So I'm going to stop here, and happy to hear other questions or discussions.
Thank you so much. We do have a question from the chat. Dr. Georgia Sandy put the question there, but before I went to that specific questions, maybe I'd like to turn to my colleague from South African Mission, Dr. Sibusiso. He's actually representing this Coalition on Science, Technology, Innovation for Africa Development. And I know you and also Heidi will have a meeting tomorrow, but I appreciate you are here, and also in your role as the chair of the coalition, as well as the former chair of the Science, Technology, Innovation Forum, STI Forum last year. Maybe you want to provide some comments. Over to you, Sibusiso.
Thanks, Wei. Good afternoon, colleagues. Sibusiso Mpama here, First Secretary Political at the Permanent Mission of South Africa. Pleasure to meet all of you. Just one slight correction. I'm not a doctor. I'm just normal Mister. Yeah, thanks. I think that was just a slip of the tongue from Wei. Yes, colleagues. Yes. So yes. South Africa is currently the chair for this year of the Coalition for STI for Africa's Development. And basically this whole year, the main focus for South Africa has been to set up a foundation for the coalition. So this year we've embarked on drawing up and adopting a terms of reference, having a co-leaders, which is the 5 countries: South Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, Cameroon, and Morocco, and then organizing a work program. And right now we are also working towards calling for membership and friendship status for the coalition. So yes. So but the other challenge we are also facing as the coalition is drawing a closer link between the coalition here in New York, the co-leads here in New York, and what is actually happening in Africa on the ground, you see. So I think that is what we are currently faced with. But that's something that's just ongoing in our conversations. That's all I can say for now. Yeah. So pardon my my limited intervention. Yeah, I'm nursing a flu, and I was really just caught off guard. Yeah, but that's all I'll say for now. Thanks, Wei.
Thank you so much, Silesiso. Appreciate you are here, and also you've been present is already a great support to the work. Thank you so much. Okay, so maybe we open up for Q&A, and I just wonder if anyone in the room, yes, Astra, please.
Thank you, Wei, and thanks also for organizing the session with Future Earth, and it's really good to have you here, Heidi, and Morgan and Anna as well, and thank you for the really informative presentations and bringing some of these very timely questions into the discussion. And I wanted to follow up because there was a good focus on the transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity of science, and this is whether it's been repackaged to fit the SDGs or has grown to meet the need for science for the SDGs. In any case, it's a positive trend and much needed for the SDG implementation. One of the and with the emergence of these 6 transitions, and also, you know, we like to look at them as being linked to the Global Sustainable Development Report and the 6 entry points. But there's been a growth in systems thinking overall, even amongst policymaking, which is crucial for the SDGs, as you know, even coming from the beginning with the 2030 agenda. But the challenge seems to be also in breaking down those silos within policymaking. You know, we know that agriculture and freshwater use and jobs and gender equality, these are all linked, but they're often dealt with in different ministries and different parts of government, and government's not designed necessarily to bring those groups together for the discussion. So just in terms of this focus also on strengthening the science policy interface, and even funding for interdisciplinary science, how do you see, you know, in Africa and in other regions, the conversations happening, the demand coming from policymakers who may not be working in that kind of cross-cutting space for the type of science that's needed for the SDGs? And are there some solutions that we can look at on how to strengthen that demand for the type of science that's growing and being offered, and with that potentially coming more funding for the science, and if the policymakers are really seeing the potential of that in providing solutions to the problems they're looking at. So just putting that out there for the science policy interfaces.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe can you respond to that? You do see the colleagues, Anna, you have your virtual race before. Maybe you can keep for that, and I'd like Heidi to quickly respond.
So I think it's a very difficult issue, and like asking what do we mean by a capacity, we also need to ask what do we mean by a policymaker? Who's a policymaker? And I think, I mean, you know, if you have examples, but I think it would be true to say that, you know, I personally know of transdisciplinary projects that are very, very successful, that involve citizens as well, community engagement, and the policymakers are local, municipality, top, but it's very purposeful, it's very local. How you scale that up to, say, even at a national level, to the engagement between a national climate science community and the relevant government departments who are all siloed and there's very little coherence in policy making, that then is that's a different challenge. So I think it works at the local level. That's what I'm saying. But as Anna said, we need to learn what is working at the local level. How do you scale that up? Farhan?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, just to build on that, like you mentioned in one of your slides, is this issue of, you know, diversity and inclusion. Also to mention that, you know, local, you know, even communities, even within South Africa itself, they were not very homogeneous societies or communities. South Africa, I don't know, we have like more than 10 languages. And for you for a community in the Western Cape, for example, which speak Zulu and their specific cultural context and how, for example, the specific beliefs, and for them now to try to merge, you know, some of the local contexts or initiatives to another part of the country, it's very, very complex and very difficult, and, you know, also very sensitive issue to deal with. So just to emphasize the fact that it's very complex and very difficult to scale up local initiatives wherever, I don't know, especially on the continent.
the other point I wanted to make is, so Future Africa was set up as a transdisciplinary platform. And I mean, it is, none of you will be surprised that even on campus, there are 30 different interpretations of what transdisciplinarity means. Anyway, we have developed and we experiment with, and it is a case of experimenting with a broader concept of transformative research approaches, where we're saying it needs to be appropriately transdisciplinary. So, you know, you need to know, depending on what issue you're looking at and at what level, will determine the engagement you need to have. But it doesn't always have to be communities, policymakers, industry, you know, it needs to be targeted to the problem that you're solving. So transdisciplinarity is fundamental, but let's not forget interdisciplinarity. It's often lost in translation. And then we say it has to be digitally enabled. This also speaks to the issue of capacities. Are we at the cutting edge of using the tools of the digital revolution in those engaged, you know, societally engaged research settings? It has to adopt a systems approach, obviously, systems thinking. And we've, following UNESCO, we've said that transformative research is research that is futures literate. So we use futures literacy approaches to also bring multi-stakeholder communities together. Because transformation is all about the future, but we actually never sit around the table and try to understand whether our visions of the future are the same. So is it, you know, that sense of, are we actually traveling in the same direction? Or do we just assume we know what kind of change we're working towards? So what we're trying to do is to say, very much in line with the missions-oriented science, but take a slightly broader perspective on what would unlock the potential of scientific knowledge to inform systems change. And so we're experimenting with this notion of transformative research, which goes beyond TD.
Can I just add that? You know, so just to, from my perspective, I think the issue probably when you're looking at implementing STI or SDGs at the local level, something that I've learned, surprisingly from Japan, is this concept which they call translocality. So it's not a matter of scaling up what is happening in a different locality, but also adapting what is working in a specific locality and try to see if it can be immersed, or you can take some learnings from a different context and apply it in a specific context. And one area which we've learned in that regard with Japan and Africa is the issue of aging. In that Japan, there is issue of aging and rural urban migration, but the dynamics in which they work in Japan is that in Africa, young people are leaving rural areas looking for jobs. In Japan, it's a totally different dynamic. It's because of aging, rural areas and rural communities are depopulating. So what we've learned from the African context is how to adapt some of the aspects of the innovation which the Japanese are using and adapt it to our context on the African continent. So that's the whole concept of translocality instead of scaling up.
Very useful. In this room, we have, at least I know, 4 colleagues are working on one particular issue on Africa, which is Africa Seeds. Max, Stephanie, Jürgen, and myself are preparing a project document on supporting science technology innovation for a small set of African seeds countries. Probably the project will start next year. So I'd like to ask 3 of you if you have any reflection from today's conversation, some takeaways you may think may be useful for planning and potentially implementing the project. Anyone want to start? Just feel free to come in. Max, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Wei. Thank you for your visit. I'm here in a really unknown field. I mean, STI is not my field, so I won't even dare ask questions. But there is one aspect that it's a comment, but I will translate this in the form of a question. Is we all agree on interdisciplinarity for this. To which extent, in addition to that, which is, I mean, first, I just started STI for SDGs as such is a title that is so overwhelming. Yes. Because even if you take the S, science is everything, and when you take SDGs, is everything. So it's overwhelming. I'm starting from that. But my question is, so we all agree about interdisciplinarity, and my question is, to which extent the STI community build a bridge with, for example, let's talk only about one sector, I mean, line ministries. How to make sure that any policy strategy, for example, from the Ministry of Agriculture is evidence-based. That only at the level of that sector, already science is taken on board. Or another question put in another, that's a national level, but another question also taken maybe at more global level, but I agree, it's important to go at regional, sub-regional, local level, I agree with that. But just another example, for example, last year was the UN Water Conference. Next year is the UN Ocean Conference. For example, for the UN Ocean Conference, they are all talking about science to action. To which extent the STI community is present in those big 4 to actually, in a very practical way, I mean, connect science, I mean, to action in the SDGs that are related to ocean. The reason why I'm asking this is, again, because I'm not at all into the STI community, and I see a gap between the STI science community discussions and then the I don't like that term, but it's a term often used, the doers. those that are just doing, implementing and formulating policy. We have the impression that sometimes that we got two different worlds, and that as much as we want within the science world and connect all the dots, maybe also the dots that we need to connect is the dots between really the science on one hand and the actions on the other. So those are maybe stupid questions.
Gosh, what sensible. Alex is going to answer it.
I mean, when I listen to this, and it's exciting to hear all these perspectives, and I heard exactly what you've been saying in various contexts over those 25 years of my UN experience. It always comes in the same way, but I think it's based on a wrong premise. And the premise here is that science is something separate, and for some people it's like a black box. For others, it's, and then we can have discussion, or science should be transdisciplinary, and there should be application of its missions, and link them to the doers and so on. But I think it's actually a wrong premise. I mean, science, modern science, it started transdisciplinary. I mean, my big hero, Leibniz, right? I mean, he's not only transdisciplinary, he was a diplomat. He did live this challenge between, the war needs of the person who funded him, the library. He was chief librarian, so this digital technology that you mentioned, all those elements actually there. And it just, as it became bigger, it had to specialize, and there had to be some systems evolve that bring these things together to actually build things. And where we've been most successful is, of course, in the military sector, right? So, where everything has been totally transdisciplinary from the very start, because the mission was there. So I can understand if people try to do this, but why don't we just actually start from the origins of modern science? It is this transdisciplinary, and most of the scientists want to be engaged. I mean, that's why we have 10 members here still doing with it. People want to have an impact. Everyone I met in labs, and myself in the past, you want to make a difference. So it's just a matter of maybe reframing this whole thing. We don't need to change science. We just need to have these avenues for people to, and institutionalize some of this, to be able to do and to make a difference. And then you don't have that question here, what is the science community interest in SITS? Because there are so many people, even innovators. These arise from scientific processes, because people want to make a difference, or they want to make money, or they want to make, ultimately it's development, isn't it? That this old style idea of science drives development. So I think we should reframe, in the UN, we should reframe this whole debate on science. Science is an integral part of development here, modern science.
The problem then is that we also have institutionalized assessment mechanisms. The way we reward scientists is not by the impact they're having on policy. It's about how many publications and how many PhD students they produce. So I would agree with you.
But even that's no longer true, right?
Well, it's very true.
Most academics have to tick a box somewhere what their societal impact were, right? I mean, that's big trend the last 10, 15 years.
I think it's very interesting. It's very important question.
But let me also say that's where issues like what's the science advisory ecosystem. So you talked about how would a Minister of Agriculture, make sure that it's making evidence-based policy. Science advisory mechanisms would be important. And you will find, for example, we run a big program on food systems sustainability, and the people who are working in that in a transdisciplinary way are very well connected with the relevant government and boundary organizations that sit between government and science. The research councils, the agricultural research council would be, and relevant NGOs and stuff. But it's a complex question. And yes, if we could just say science is about the world, we do science in order to have an impact on the world, that would be wonderful. But then we'd need to reward, fund, incentivize scientists to respond in that way.
The next, for the exercise we do on the mapping of STI capacity of steel, the agriculture ministry can do it too. I mean, no one really sees it as the ministry.
Of course, of course.
But I know Megan has some points to come in. Anna, you have to leave or not? I don't know if you can be a bit.
No, I can stay. I mean, I'm here, so might as well just stay. No, I just had a little comment on the last discussion, and then a question for Morgan, if I still can. So on the last question, I mean, for us in UNESCO, it's kind of what we do, right? The intergovernmental scientific programs are exactly there to bring the scientific community around the issues that are then discussed at these conferences. And actually, it is that community that frames those conferences, not necessarily just the policymakers. So particularly when it comes to water or oceans, this is where our intergovernmental programs are very, very active. And you have this huge network of scientists that are actually working on the similar issues. And, you know, it's the exciting part of UNESCO that you actually do kind of have the scientific community working on your programs together with the governments as well. But my question for Morgan was around the mission-oriented science, and a little bit, I wonder also what the reaction from the scientific community is on mission-oriented science, because it feels very mission, or I mean, it's a good thing, I suppose, but it also takes away from a little bit broader science perspective, including, you know, curiosity-driven science, and how do you get inside the conversation. I mean, I know that our scientific communities, when we just speak about, you know, look at the SDGs as a framework towards which one can work, they're like, yeah, but, you know, there is also basic science. There is science that doesn't necessarily have a purpose. And I know that in the context we are talking here about, you know, SDGs, etc. But I think, I don't know, I feel like it would be very difficult from UNESCO perspective to promote mission-oriented science, because I can see a lot of scientists with their red flag saying, what about those that do not enter into that particular mission, and the science that is happening on the side, and all kinds of innovation that can happen beyond that specific mission. So just a question to see a little bit how that is working.
That's a great question, and I'm glad that you asked it.
If I may, also George, quite a while ago, he posted a question in the chat, a similar question. But I may ask George to just say a few words about your question on the mission-oriented science approach. George, can you hear us?
George seems frozen.
Yeah, frozen. But anyway, so he's asking if I can. So there's someone argue that the mission-oriented approach, there is over concentration of resources on a primary mission goal. For example, on the 90%, are you there? 90% of zero carbon energy sources in energy mix within 5 years would mean we devote a significant part of the national budget to the mission, to that mission. So in Africa, it appears the other development goals may suffer given the limited resources available. How would we counter this argument?
Thank you for both of those questions, then, and I hope, George, that you can hear us, if not see us moving live. Both really good questions, and Anna, thank you for articulating that the way that you did, because I think that you've in part hit the nail right on the head, that this conversation among friends about the SDGs is quite a sort of a narrow dive into the conversation about mission-oriented science, because as I said, this needs to be in complement to continued support for disciplinary science. This is absolutely not a conversation about defunding or disinvesting in disciplinary sciences, in blue sky research and so on, but rather in mobilizing new research so that the enabling conditions can be put in place to also support mission-oriented research, which brings together actors also from the disciplinary sciences so that they can come together into these broader conversations within the context of science for action. I'm sorry that Max is no longer here, but that's really the key, is how do we bring these things to bear upon the needed, the urgent policy questions. And I think the reality is that disciplinary science has an essential role there and always has. But to make the kinds of change we need when we're talking about 6 transitions, we're talking, as you said, about siloed approaches that need to come together. Disciplinary actors have to talk to one another. You mentioned we collaborate within disciplines now. We have to bring them across those silos and with other forms of knowledge making. And as far as the concern that's very understandable about how do you pitch this to disciplinary actors who may say, well, that sounds a lot like, this is being recorded, so I'll be very careful about my words, but about dirty words like politicizing science or co-opting science for specific societal issues, that the ISC is very fortunate to represent both the national academies, for example, which are interdisciplinary but rooted in specific national contexts, and the disciplinary unions, which represent disciplines worldwide, and that all of them as members sign off on the work that we're doing at the multilateral level. So it's really a key component of this to make sure that we're bringing along all of those actors. And if you want, I think it would be very interesting, if you haven't yet, to have more of a conversation between UNESCO and the ISC about this particular model, which we are continuing to fundraise on with exactly what you've brought up in mind. And I'd be happy to connect you, although no doubt you already are, to our science team. I know you recently talked to our comms team, and it's nice to meet you, by the way, finally. But about how to address those kinds of concerns that I know you will hear and we will hear, and making sure that everybody understands this as an inclusive way forward to bridge science to action. And if I may, although there may be follow-up questions, briefly to address the 2 questions that were brought before, I think that the ISC hopes that one of the ways forward is to continue building on the really important work that's been done by Future Africa, by ICSU, by many predecessor organizations, that's continuing to be done by UNESCO, to enhance these science policy interfaces so that we're creating demand for evidence-informed decision-making, which means turning to the scientific community in its many manifestations to say, what's the evidence? And then making sure that the scientific community and its interlocutors are ready to say, well, there's not one evidence. We have these many disciplinary perspectives. We have transdisciplinary perspectives, and making sure that the evidence they can turn to is rooted in these foundational principles about crossing silos, about addressing root causes, synergies, and trade-offs, and that having that language and framing available at the interface is one of the ways I think we believe and hope that we can help to mainstream and further legitimize this idea of crossing boundaries in all of our work. But really, then I know that Anna, you'll have much to say about open science as a related principle there, and also about how this is manifesting in a current effort to bridge across countries within the African region. Huge questions.
May I add something?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Anna, I think as I speak with my hat on as a member of the commission, I think that, and it's unfortunate, it's a language issue. We could have called this transdisciplinary, solutions-oriented science at a regional level. So missions has a very Mariana Mazzucato kind of flavor to it. But essentially it transcends that basic applied science divide. Depending on what your mission is, you're going to need your basic scientists there. You're going to need your fundamental knowledge partners. But I wanted to then say, since I've been at Future Africa, and given that we're a platform for transdisciplinary research, I can tell you how some of the communities are responding. What they like about the work of the commission is that here is an undertaking to be serious about funding the skills and capacities you need for transdisciplinary work, for meaningful transdisciplinarity. So in other words, you don't get given your usual research grant and then how you engage with stakeholders do you have the relevant boundary skills, the facilitation skills, and the technology necessary to reach out to those stakeholders? And all of that's taken for granted. And the Commission is saying we need to fund this. You need to make sure that in those mission hubs, there are people who have experience in engagement with the stakeholders, who understand the world of policy, and you fund that capacity. You also fund the data capacity that you need. You fund the open science capacity that you need. So it's a more comprehensive funding. It's putting your money where your mouth is, rather than expecting scientists to jump through all these hoops and be transdisciplinary, but actually the resourcing for that is not there. So people are very excited from what I'm hearing, saying finally, you know, there's serious funding for the kind of work that we're expected to do. And longer term funding. Transdisciplinarity takes longer than you're sitting on your own and doing your research project. And I think the Commission has recognized those foundational conditions and capacities need to be funded. And that speaks to some of the capacity issues. Yeah. Transboundary skills, diplomacy skills, advisory skills, all of that. Part of the capacities for STI, for SDGs.
So we map everything.
Yeah, map everything.
Colleagues, any?
Well, let me,
Go ahead.
sorry, just actually more question. What I found interesting, what Anna mentioned is this set of 800, I think you mentioned the policies. I would be interested to have a look at what it actually is and see how, what kind of policy it is, what kind of enabling environment can we see, and what experience have governments or entities had when it comes to these policies. So I'm looking forward to learn a little bit more about this policy database and see whether there has been any kind of review of practicality or impact of these policies. And then I'm kind of with Max. It's a huge undertaking when we look at science, technology for innovation for SDGs. I mean, if I just want to compartmentalize it, one is really the capacity in the educational sector. How do I make sure that I have enough capacity, people who are educated, trained scientists who develop a community without leaving the countries, without going to the US or going to study there that never come back? How do you have an environment where people let's say motivated to stay where they are because it has an environment what engage them where they are? I mean, sounds a little bit patronizing to a certain extent, but I see that in certain countries there has been changes what goes over decades, where the US tend to be very attractive for a lot of people. But nowadays there are other areas like India has become a scientific hub, China has come back up. So there are definitely areas. Kenya has been showing that in Africa it has shown that it can develop. South Africa has shown that also. So there's a way, how do you, when we look at now the small island developing states where we're looking at, they're so tiny.
Yeah.
And the danger that you educate the people, but then they're leaving. I mean, in my country, we had that in certain areas where we had policies to help underprivileged areas. When I grew up, it was the border to the east. Then later now it becomes different areas. It's still East Germany where it's like underdevelopment. You have policies to reverse these kind of trends. But how do you do that for small countries that they can leverage on an international network, that they keep people and can leverage on international knowledge? I don't think it's necessarily bad to have partnerships between the North and the South. That's not.
Yeah.
And we heard in others, some of these universities who were presented from the UK are pretty much interested to partner with universities, academic institutions in Africa, and finding ways to work together. So I think these kind of initiatives, what kind of policies can bring enabling environment that, I mean, the first step is that we develop a scientific community. Once you have the community, it's also better to engage these people in finding solutions. But if you don't have the people, how do you rely? Then you always have this northern scientists coming bring their solutions. That's not really, I think the first step is really educating the people who are there and also make sure that they have the environment to stay and help the local problems. But just one thinking.
Huge issues.
Even the SIDS and many African countries, the bigger ones, I think they're very different situation and contexts for science, right? The SIDS are very open, also for research cooperation. There's lots of going back and forth. The problem is the vulnerability in the small market. So there's no many opportunity to then translate that in, to startup and things like that. Whereas in, bigger African countries, they have entirely different situation there. They cannot be that open. They cannot easily build these infrastructures for the many more people. They also have to accommodate and
need to find a
the
cooperation.
Development priorities they have to balance. So I think if you go for this project, I think we should really clearly distinguish what the problems are in these countries specifically, but also the groups of countries. It's very different.
I mean, for SIDS,
my experience.
in some ways, everything is local because they're so small. So this idea of the translocality, I think, is really constructive, and it's. I think we should work that into. I mean, that's what SIDS do already. Just within regions, they're constantly sharing, and then across regions of SIDS. But yeah, it's just been great to hear about the kinds of networks and resources that are available. And we can try to bring that into the project more, because that's the only way SIDS survive is through partnerships because they are so small. So thank you.
And also, I mean, Stephanie and Jorgen, you can really reach out to us to connect you with our colleagues that are working specifically on STI and SIDS. It's one of our cross-cutting priorities. The whole section on SIDS is actually sitting in the natural sciences sector. So it might be good to have a talk with them and see also. And I think the nice part of the work of UNESCO on SIDS, they work on science technology, but also on education and culture at the same time. So, and it's very important, particularly this cultural context, etc., in the SIDS. So it might be good just to exchange with them and see if there is something they can contribute to your project or give you access to some contacts or something like that. So please don't hesitate to come to us as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, and there's another element to take into account is, science education. So when we're talking science, what do we mean? It's not just, it's different from research. So a lot of what, was in my presentation focused more on scientific research. But you raise, the vast area of scientific education. Huge.
So
it's a big project.
It is, and it's 20 minutes over. But it's a worthwhile discussion, and for me, it's a banquet of all this intelligent discussions. I wish that these things can continue. Maybe it's a luxury to be having you in person here, but maybe some kind of online continuation of the exchange. As I said, there's a dedicated working group preparing this work on the manual, on the guidebook. So this could be a space for us to not getting our brilliant ideas lost. So we invite colleagues to join sharing even a few lines of your thoughts, anything you think valuable, which potentially be practical, particularly for a guide for the local and national actionable follow-ups. So those are the things we're really looking forward for our continued discussions. And I really appreciate today Future Africa, International Science Council, UNESCO colleagues are here, and we want to continue work with you on this initiative and continue our discussions on the way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wei.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.